Okay, good morning. It is a privilege for me to be here, actually. I wanted to start with an apology, and the apology essentially is that I'm not Chris Deedy, which is because technology baffles me, totally baffles me. So I was asked if I could put some polling questions into the presentation. Fine, I thought show of hands, but no, it's not a show of hands. It's a technology-based polling survey. So I thought everybody raises their mobile phones, right? That's the one. No, apparently not. Apparently, within the app, there is, if you go to the agenda, there's a keynote part, you look at that, and it will download a poll. So when the polling questions come up, you then get to vote on the questions. So the presentation is about learning networks and expertise. It's about how we capitalize on new approaches to knowledge mobilization and education. It's building on a lot of work that I've been doing in England with a number of schools in England currently. I thought it'd be good just to talk about my kind of background on this. I started life as a policymaker. I started life as the head of research within the Department for Education in England. And I started doing my PhD, and that got me thinking, really, about why policy tends to be mostly driven by ideology and less so much about the kind of evidence, the rich evidence that was in the system at the time, and how you could balance those two things, how you could make those two things work more effectively. When I finished my PhD, I then moved into academia, and I started thinking about, and I was kind of exposed more to schools and evidence-informed practice in schools. So I started to join together my thinking there and looked at the interconnection between evidence use from the top and evidence use at the bottom, and how those two things might join together. And then most recently, I've been looking entirely at evidence-informed practice and how we can make evidence-informed practice a reality in English schools. So current areas of focus, current areas that are important for me, current areas that are important in England are kind of threefold, I think. The first is that if you've got autonomy, if you've got the ability to be able to decide how to run your school, how to run your district, how do you make decisions about what to choose, about what interventions you want to put in place, about what you want to do differently, and how does research fit into that? Secondly, if school leaders want to run evidence-engaged schools, research-engaged schools, what do they need to do, and what support, or how do they know how to do that? Do we need things like coaching? Do we need to help our school leaders know what's required of them to become evidence-informed? And then the last thing really is, how can educational practitioners most effectively engage with research? And it's really that I'm going to talk about in this session today. Okay, so good to start with a bit of context. I think we all know what education-informed practice means, but it's good to start with a definition. And this is the definition put forward by Department for Education in England. And what's important here is that they talk about a combination of practitioner expertise and the best educational evidence that's there. And that notion of combination is important. It's not about saying, okay, here's the evidence, this is what you need to do, here's a set of guidelines or advice, you must implement it without question. It's about saying, what do we know as teachers, as practitioners? What do we know that works? What do we know about our context? And how do we marry together what's been shown to be effective on a more general level? How do we contextualize what we do? We keep the underpinning principles that make it work in place, but we make sure it's relevant and appropriate for the situation that we're in. And there's growing evidence on the kind of evidence, the benefits of evidence use within education. So you've got colleagues like John Sapovich saying, actually, the best performing school systems, if we look at places like Finland, if we look at places like Singapore, they're the ones that use research and evidence in two ways. First of all, they use the research and evidence to identify the problems. What are the issues that are causing white working class boys not to perform as effectively as they might, for example, or for us to not to be encouraging our children to have growth mindsets, and then to actually use the research and evidence following that to develop solutions, to develop appropriate interventions to put in place. And John says that's the characteristic that defines high-performing school systems. But you've also got other colleagues like Minku, like Philippa Cordley, basically saying where there's correlations now that show where evidence is used as part of high-quality initial teacher training, continuing professional development, headship training, actually that these are making a positive difference to teachers, to schools, and to the school system more generally. You've also got colleagues such as David Godfrey, Graham Hanscom saying, actually, if we start to have research engagement within schools, meaningful research engagement with schools, schools are starting to move away from top tips models of improvement, so kind of anecdotal models of improvement, to really understanding in a true way what seems to work for whom and for why. More generally, we have this idea surrounding evidence use of self-improvement. And I think this is kind of a common across a number of jurisdictions worldwide. We've had, recession after recession. We've had the kind of reduction in funding in school systems. And the notion of top-down mandates is kind of, and support is slipping back somewhat. And actually, it's now contingent more and more on schools and school system to seek out, to develop, to share effective practice. And this is really nicely emphasized in England, where since around 2010, we've had what's called the self-improving school system. And this is where schools are positioned as being accountable, but also autonomous, and that there's competition through parental choice and other factors, along with a kind of reduction in local oversight. And a professor in my department, Toby Green, he says actually there are 4 criteria for self-improvement. And this is this idea that teachers and schools must be responsible for what they do, but they need to learn from each other and from research so effective practice spreads, and that the best schools and leaders start to extend their reach across other schools so that all schools improve. All the while, as I said before, that kind of support from the outside reduces. So it's down to schools to identify how and why they need to improve. And it's kind of not surprising then that evidence use of research use joins together within that. So you've got this idea that teaching schools and teaching schools alliances are those officially charged. They have a mandate to draw on the best available evidence as they contribute to alliance priorities, to base new initiatives on existing evidence, and to be able to measure the impact of these initiatives, and to make sure that staff are using existing evidence, but also supporting staff, freeing up time in the day, freeing up kind of space for them to work together, making sure that staff have training, potentially opportunities to do master's degrees, and so on and so forth. So, Research Learning Communities Project. I'm reminded now that this is the first polling point, I think. So, have you heard of Research Learning Communities before? This is a brief yes or no. You have to answer the question through the app. That's all I know. Okay, so the history of research learning communities essentially starts in 2014, where the Education Endowment, it's working. With the Education Endowment Foundation, we've had at least 100 people respond, fantastic. With the Education Endowment Foundation, said, okay, well, we know a lot about what seems to be effective in schools. We know about what seems to work in schools. But the problem for us is that nobody's really engaging with this research. Nobody's really acting on this research. And they put out a big call asking kind of for bids, for ideas on how we can increase research use in school. And so I brought together a team of colleagues and said, okay, what do we know about what works to increase research use in school? And I kind of, I've gone the wrong way. And our experience drew from a number of different sources. So we worked with the National College for Teaching and Learning on their Research and Development Themes project. Louise Stoll, who I'm sure you know, has done extensive work on professional learning communities. We've worked on looking at middle leaders, so teacher leaders, as catalysts for evidence-informed change. We've worked in the early years sector using research-informed lesson studies. So we brought together all these ideas, all this knowledge, and we came up with a number of overarching principles for what seems to work in schools, what seems to be effective in schools. And the first of those is this idea of cycle of inquiry. So research use isn't or shouldn't be a one-off activity. It needs to start with this idea of vision. It needs to start off with this idea of this is where we're trying to get to. This is what we want to reach. And when we understand where we want to get to, we need to understand where we currently are. We need to understand what our baseline kind of reality is. And that's then when we start to introduce research. So we say, how are we going to close this gap between our vision, where we're trying to get to, our aims, our ambition, and where we're currently at? And you're using research. You engage with research. You start to develop an intervention or a solution. You embed that solution. And you evaluate, and you continue to evaluate, and you see whether it's starting to work to close the gap. And if it's not, you change it, or you adjust it, or you ditch it, and you start again. And if it is, well done, but you keep going. You don't stop after one cycle. You keep going, and you keep going. So that was the first thing that we wanted to look at, this idea of cycle of inquiry. The second thing is this notion of expertise. This on the screen is the Dreyfus model of expertise. And it's used by a Danish sociologist called Flivberg to kind of suggest how people become experts. And what Flivberg says is there are 5 stages. So you start off anything. You start off as a novice. And a novice starts by using instruction and kind of context-free principles and a kind of guidance on how to act. So if you think about learning how to drive a car, for example, the novice, has a kind of a highway code, for instance, can know how, what the braking distances are in theory, knows if you drive stick clutch, the biting points of gears, knows the idea that you need to mirror, signal, maneuver, and so on. And you can learn all of that without even stepping into a car. But it doesn't mean you can drive, right? And it's only by engaging in the process of driving and engaging in the process of driving in different situations that you begin to become an expert, because you begin to learn how to respond, how to apply those principles in different situations. And then you become more competent, and then you become proficient, and then you become kind of intuitively and holistically aware of how to drive. It's almost at that point where you start to zone out when you drive, because you just know how to respond, and it's only when something new comes up or something, or some kind of warning signal comes up that you kind of come out of that zone. And that's what expertise is. It's that ability to intuitively and holistically know how to respond in a given situation. Another example of expertise, I guess, this is a guide to hand washing, 12-stage guide to hand washing. You see it in a number of toilets, in hospitals, and so on and so forth. This is kind of the ideal of hand washing, right? This is the gold standard of hand washing. I'm not going to embarrass you by asking how many of you use these 12 steps, right? I mean, we'd hope our doctors use them before they're going to operate on us. But this is the kind of gold standard. But what we do when we wash our hands, we know, if we've been out playing in the woods or, whatever else, we don't have to labor the point. But which of those stages we should be engaging with at any one time? If we've just been working at our desk and we want to have a bit of supper, we'll probably just have a bit of soap and water, and that's fine. So we know how to respond to that kind of ideal of hand washing. Another example, this guy is Kevin Keegan, who's kind of a soccer hero of mine. He used to play in the 70s and late 80s. And he's talking about safety, road safety. He's got the Green Cross Code T-shirt on. Now, there's a couple of messages that come out here. I mean, first of all, as I'll talk about later, having someone you respect, having someone you admire, having someone you trust telling you how to cross the road is probably a bit more inspirational than maybe this guy, possibly. But again, with road crossing, there is a number of stages to cross the road. Now, the irony here, of course, is that I don't know if you have hedgehogs in Canada, but most of the hedgehogs I see in England are squashed by the side of the road, right? So how inspirational having hedgehogs teaching you how to cross the road, I'm not quite sure. But the Green Cross Code, there are 5 stages to cross the road. Actually, there is a 6th stage at the bottom, stay alive, but I think that's a given, right? But how many people use 5 stages to cross the road? Certainly, I was only in Toronto a few minutes when I realized you could kind of randomly run across the road and you'd be pretty much okay. So, yeah, we use it, to teach children, to make sure they're safe. But after you become an expert road crosser, you don't need to you have knowledge of the ideal, but you don't need to follow the ideal. So my point here, generally, is that in terms of research use, we wanted people to become expert research users. We wanted people to engage in research in such a way that it intuitively joined with their practitioner knowledge, with their understanding of context, with their understanding of knowing how to behave. So that in a classroom, or when running a school, or in any other situation, we didn't have to unnaturally pause and look at the research and know what to do, and then come back and carry on teaching. You had an expanded repertoire of understanding of how to respond. Professional learning communities. I think we all know about professional learning communities, but essentially they are situations in which people with a vested interest in improving education come together. They have a shared vision and purpose. People take collective responsibility for student learning. People collaborate in a way that goes beyond the kind of superficial means of sharing something. They kind of work really closely together. And what makes professional learning communities work, what makes them effective, is that they operate within a culture of trust and inquiry, and that you introduce diverse perspectives into professional learning communities, such as research. And the reason we wanted to use professional learning communities is essentially that when they operate well, when they operate effectively, they increase teacher learning, and that teacher learning increases student outcomes. Now, there is a connection here to expertise. And the reason why professional learning communities is effective and the reason why they work well is because of this idea of learning conversations, the thing that happens within professional learning communities. Now, this is a diagram that was put forward first by two Japanese business economists called Nanaka and Takuchi, who were looking to explain the success of Japanese industry in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And what they said was that actually there's this spiraling, this four-stage spiraling that happens in Japanese firms. First of all, you have this idea of externalization. So if you think about in your staff room or in your district, you have tens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands years worth of experience, right? But that stays within your heads unless you make that explicit. So you might be having tacit-to-tacit knowledge conversations, and we might be making a lot of assumptions about the other person knowing or having the same level of experience as we do, but those are assumptions. And actually, when you're talking to someone about how to improve the way that they mark, you might be thinking that they've tried all these other approaches that you know about because you've been in the game 30 or 40 years, and that they're coming to you for something on top of that, whereas actually the solutions might be in the minds already of the people that are there. So the important thing in a learning conversation to start off with is to make all of our tacit knowledge explicit, to scaffold, so that we are able to scaffold moving forward. The next thing we do then is to start to combine this knowledge. So if we think about growth mindsets, if we think about feedback, marking, and moderation, is to start to combine this tacit knowledge that we've made explicit with the other research that's out there, with the other knowledge that's out there. So we take on board what we know about what's great in terms of growth mindsets or feedback and marking and moderation. We take what we know and we put them together and we start to co-create new knowledge that is situated effectively within our given school or context or district and so on. But the next thing we have to do is start to internalize that knowledge. We have to make that knowledge tacit again. And the reason, or the way we do that, is that we start to practice it. So if you remember what I was saying about expertise and about this idea that you can learn all this stuff in theory, this combination stuff in theory, but you need to start practicing it, and practicing it in different situations and knowing how to respond and how to use it to engage in different situations. So you can do that through things like lesson study or joint practice development, learning walks, and so on and so forth. And as you keep doing that, and as you do that again and again and again, it becomes tacit. And suddenly the knowledge within the school or within the board or whatever else has become expanded, and those tacit-to-tacit conversations are suddenly a lot richer and a lot full of a lot more knowledge than they used to be before. So that's this idea of learning conversations and how that delivers expertise. Also important, clearly, is professional learning communities working in a networked way. If we're going to do this kind of stuff at scale, we need to bring schools together, and then we need to help them work together and support each other. So thinking about that kind of tacit knowledge conversation, if we're talking about the tacit knowledge in the school, that's one thing, but the tacit knowledge across a wider network or across a board or so on, that's much more powerful, right? And the more we can join together, the more we can share, the more we can get out of our brains, and the more we can make our tacit knowledge explicit, the more benefit every school in that network is likely to have. Now, it's this idea of leadership as influence that started to move us to the notion of opinion formers. Now, on the left here, we've got a kind of traditional hierarchical model of what leadership looks like in a school or in a district. And you've got the school leader at the top, the principal at the top. You've then got assistants and deputies and subject leaders sitting beneath them. And this model of leadership is important because if you think about transformational leadership, if you think about learning-centered leadership, that enables the person at the top to set a vision, to get people on board, to give people direction, and also to make sure that the supporting structures are there for people to come together and for them to collaborate and for them to share resource and for them to work in meaningful ways. But if we think about flows of influence, if we think about who we trust within the school, who we turn to for friendship, support, and advice, who we might want to collaborate with, flows of influence look very, very different. And actually, they tend to look a little bit more like this, with the most important people being the ones that connect to other people. And that means two things. It means they're able to draw down on the expertise of all those other people to be able to solve problems, so that puts them in a really powerful position. If we think about social capital as being the kind of resource that exists within a social network that we are able to access and use, that means these people can draw on and access a lot more than others. But if we also think of these people as being able to kind of communicate outwards, those people are the ones who are able to spell out the message and to send out the message to their friends and peers in a much more effective way. So we wanted to capture these people. We wanted to bring them into the project and get them to act as research champions. So kind of bringing that together kind of led us to this idea of a research learning community or research learning communities, which are networked learning communities that focus on engaging in and with research in order to tackle issues of teaching and learning. Research learning communities operate in cycles of inquiry, and they facilitate capacity building both across the network and within the schools participating. For this particular project, we recruited 110 elementary schools across England. We created a randomized control trial, so half of those got the support, half of those became the control group. So with the 55 schools, we formed 10 research learning communities. The people within those communities were senior leaders and opinion formers, at least. There could be others if they wanted to bring others along, but at least those people. And what we do within the learning community is to kind of engage in this kind of workshop approach where we start off by saying, okay, what do we know? Having those kind of making that tacit knowledge explicit type of conversation. What do we know about a given topic, be it growth mindsets, be it feedback marking and moderation? Then introducing the research into that, and then getting them to think about the current reality, the current baseline, the current situation that they face, and where they want to go. And in between that, schools go back, they share, they say, this is what we know, please add to this knowledge. They come back in and they say, okay, well, we've been collecting data on our current reality, we've been expanding what we know, we're ready to develop a solution. They develop a solution, an approach, an intervention. We talk to them about trialing, how to trial that effectively, how to begin to make that a reality within the school. They go away, they trial it, they collect data, they come back, they refine it. With this, okay, now you need to know how to embed this in a meaningful way. We talk about change management, we engage them with the work of Cotter and Fullen and so on and so forth. They go back, they start to embed, they see whether it's making a difference. They come back and they share the impact data on that. The way we approach this topic is we asked the head teachers of the schools involved what subjects they wanted to focus on. So rather than necessarily looking at the data straight away, although that might have been an advantage to do that, we said, what is it that interests you? And then throughout, we're using an evidence-informed approach and evidence-informed exercises to help them engage with the research. And I'll explain a little about those in a second. Importantly, it's a 2-year project, and importantly, during year 2, we're capacity building. So we facilitate in year 1, and we work with the schools in year 1, and we show them what we need them to do. In year 2, we start to push back, and in year 2, they're running their own workshop activities. We're supporting, we're offering phone calls, we're saying to them, okay, this is how we suggest you might do this, but they're doing it themselves. And so that's really important to us, because at the end of year 2, we're not there anymore, and we want year 3 to carry on and carry on and carry on. And we'll give them a toolkit to help them with that approach. And year 2 then looks slightly different. So in the morning, these schools are running activities themselves. We'll engage with some further capacity building in areas that they think is important in the afternoon, and then we'll plan for the next workshop, and we'll go through that support. And in many ways, I feel like a very proud father now when I'm going into these schools in the 2nd year, because they're coming back and they're saying, look what we've done, look what we've created, look at these amazing literature reviews we've got, or look at the way we've collected this data, or we've made sense of this data, or look at the way this intervention is working. And it kind of feels very nice for me to see that working in a really real and tangible way. We've engaged in a lot of different approaches to knowledge mobilization within the learning communities. And some of these, some of these are great. Some of these maybe just work in the particular schools that we're in. But it's useful to kind of to share and show what we've been doing here, I think. So I wasn't really going to labor the point about what knowledge mobilization is. I mean, Ontario, you guys invented knowledge mobilization as far as I'm concerned. Essentially, what knowledge mobilization means to me, though, is about the research that's out there being used. So that's kind of how we approach this. So you can ignore the kind of the obfuscatory definition at the top. It doesn't, it doesn't help, I don't think. It's about using research in a meaningful way. And what we've done is use a lot of interactive and static approaches to engaging with research, including model making, prop making, using strip activities, posters, jigsaw exercises, adopter cards, games. So we've tried all different ways of saying how best can we share evidence in a meaningful way that people act on in schools. And the first thing we did was really start to use props and models. So this idea is based on kind of work that says if you've got people coming together from different areas, from at different hierarchical levels, so you've got the opinion former, but that opinion former is not going to be at the same level as the school leader, and you've got different teachers and school leaders coming together from different schools, and we want them to negotiate, and we want them to talk about what's happening or what they know about a given topic. We need something to bring them together. We need some kind of boundary object that works effectively within these schools. And so we wanted something that could develop with them, a shared language or a metaphor for what they were trying to talk about. And I wanted to have fun as well, right? So we brought in Lego, we brought in different props and ideas, and we started to get them to play with these props and to model these props. And where this fits within this kind of knowledge use cycle is that we're trying to externalize. And the best way to externalize, as I've said, is to get them on the topic of growth mindsets, on feedback marking or moderation, on these other things, to actually come together and say, this is what this means for me. This is how growth mindsets currently operate in my school. This is how feedback marking moderation, this is how teaching English as an additional language currently works in my school. And that worked really well to get them to work quickly together to share. And then we start to formalize the knowledge that's coming out of that in terms of themes. The next thing we did was to use what we called strips. So all schools, all network research learning communities are focused on given topics, right? So they might be focused on English as additional language. They might be focused on feedback and marking moderation. And so to introduce the research to them, what we did was to create a systematic review for each of those topics. But we didn't want to just give them the systematic review and go, here you go, this is what we know about what works in education, because it's unlikely that people will learn from that. And the important thing is that you learn from the research, right? So if you think about what Stephen Katz says, for example, in terms of intentional interruption, what's important is that you are accommodating, not assimilating knowledge. You are not making knowledge fit within your existing frame. You're actually challenging and expanding the way you think, right? So what we did was once they've externalized knowledge and once they've developed that into themes, once they understand what's effective in terms of the given topic or question they were looking at, we took these systematic reviews, and this took me a long time with a pair of scissors to cut them up into, it really did, into little strips and say, here you go, make sense of this, what does this tell you? And they kind of inductively then had to theme the research in conjunction or in relation to what they already knew. So, and they had to answer, how is this challenging what I know? How is this augmenting what I know? How has this surprised me? How has this inspired me? And then obviously at the end we gave them the systematic review to share. But we found that was a really effective way to get people thinking about what the research was saying, to get ideas flowing into their minds. Just a quick note on the kind of the issue of quality, really, in terms of the research. I like to draw on what Sandra Nutley says here about actually, when we think about the quality of research, it's problematic, it's difficult, it depends on the questions we're asking, it depends on the context, it depends on what we're trying to use the research for. And in England as well, we've got a very kind of high stakes level of accountability at the moment. So there's a lot of pressure as a result of that for teachers to draw on kind of concrete, let's say, quantitative research and evidence. So to draw on things such as Hattie's visible learning, to draw on things such as the EF toolkit. And whilst I think these are important in that they explain the what they don't do is necessarily always talk about the why, and they don't provide that kind of the kind of answers that qualitative that research provides. So we wanted to make sure that schools knew what quality research was, both in terms of the quantitative and the qualitative aspects. And so we introduced them to this idea that both are important, but we can't overclaim from each. What's the warrant that's being made from this research, and how justifiable is that based on the methodology that was in place? Are there producer interests? Are there cognitive biases you need to worry about? What are the dangers of cargo cult science? And if you don't know what cargo cult science is, essentially, after the Second World War, you had a lot of American air bases in a lot of islands in the Pacific. And the people who lived on these islands were watching what the Americans were doing, and they were kind of acting in certain ways. They were doing this with sticks. They were sitting in towers with things on their ears. And planes were coming down, and they were leaving cargo, and they were taking off again. And when the Americans left, the planes stopped coming, And so the people tried to replicate what they saw. So they did this with sticks, and they sat in towers, and they put these things on their ears, because they thought that's what was driving change. And of course, that wasn't the theory of action or the underpinning mechanisms that were driving change, right? So you've got to understand what that theory of action is, what it is that makes sense, and how that can be applied to your school. Yeah, we use a kind of a poster format in order to kind of provide an ambient approach to knowledge mobilization, to making sure that schools have, they're kind of flooded with the messages that school teachers want to have. And this is, really kind of present a headline or a meme at the top to bring people in. Do you have Marmite in Canada? No? Okay. Right. Marmite, I don't know, is some kind of punishment food that they give children. But the kind of strapline for Marmite, I think they've realized this, is that you love it or you hate it. So we kind of got them to try and think about these kind of memes or these top lines that would bring people in to have a look. But the most important way to mobilize knowledge is going back to this kind of diagram, with this idea that actually the school leader needs to make sure that people are able to come together, that they're able to have space to talk and to negotiate and to collaborate. But the opinion formers are the ones that need to act as the champions for the intervention, and the ones that need to kind of act as the advocates and to G people along. So, second polling question is, do you have ready access to opinion formers in your life? Yes or no? Because it's interesting. We use social network analysis to find our opinion formers. And that's an interesting approach, but it's interesting to see whether people know who their opinion formers are and whether they can readily access them. And then just kind of finishing off on this this knowledge and knowledge mobilization. The internalization, as I said before, it comes from two things. It comes from this idea of lesson study. It comes from this idea of change management and what change management is and how that can be effective. Measuring success is an interesting one for us, and we've looked at this in a number of different ways. So the first thing is, how do schools know how to measure success? And when we start on the workshops, what we do is we put up this diagram to help people vision. And we say, okay, if we're successful in terms of feedback, marking, and moderation, if we're successful in terms of growth mindsets, what will be different? How will our children be responding? How will they be feeling? What will they be saying? What will they be doing? And we get them to work on that. And we get them to say, okay, if we embed this is for us what vision means. This is what it'll be. And then we kind of show them this diagram and say, okay, well, that's the impact you want to make. And we'll be doing research-informed strategies to help with that. But if they're doing this in the future, if they're saying this, if they're feeling this, if they're behaving this way in the future, what are they doing now and how do we know? And we work with them quite in a lot of detail to ascertain the baseline data, to ascertain ways of measuring the current situation so that they can ascertain whether they're making a difference. And so we say, okay, well, what types of sources of data will we need? What ones are standardized and are there already and that can be collected quite easily? What others do you need to add detail on top of that? So do we need to work with you to develop an observation schedule? Do we need to work with you to develop an interview schedule or a survey? And so we get a mixture of kind of very customized data that's context-specific and also standardized data that can be used to compare success across the piece. And then at the end, or as we go along, we get kind of data coming back, such as the impact on teacher practice. This next chart is a little complicated because it's kind of perceived impact on pupil outcomes because we didn't have the final standardized data yet to look at that. So we got them to work together and say, okay, they were working in lesson study trios in this particular school. Together, how did they negotiate what pupils were like at the beginning and how were they like at the end? But we'll replace that with standardized data as we go forward. In October, as I said, there's a randomized control trial. The project is being independently evaluated by a separate university, University of Bristol. So in October, we'll know whether this not only has had impact on teacher practice and their ability to engage in research, but whether it's changed the outcomes for primary pupils, for elementary pupils, in terms of their standardized findings. So that's a big deal for us, because if that is the case, then actually the EF will start to begin to roll this process out up and down the country. So that's important. But the tricky thing for me, the thing that excited me, was this idea of how do you measure teacher expertise? How do you know if this process has changed the way that teachers are engaging with research, and whether they're engaging with research in a meaningful way that's changed how they think, but allowed them to intuitively and holistically respond to a given situation? And we looked at a number of different scales for this. This one's the kind of Landry ladder of research use, which is okay, it's fine, because it looks at reception. How do people respond to the research? Did it change the way they think? Has it led to discussion? Has it led to them kind of readily talking about it to others? Are they beginning to think about how they might use it? And that's fine, but it didn't go quite far enough for us. And what we wanted to do was actually think about, how do you measure a typology of people saying, yeah, now the research is kind of intuitively, I'm using it intuitively. I mean, that's very, very different. So in the end, this is quite a detailed scale. Hopefully you can read it, but the slides are in the pack. We came up with a very detailed scale that kind of stretches from people not using it at all to them finding their way around the research. So thinking about driving the car or thinking about people learning to cross the road, how they're finding their way around the research in question. Whether they've started to make plans to use it, have they started to use it in a kind of competent way? Do they have to keep referring back to the research to do it? Are they beginning to do it and customize it? Are they beginning to do it, customize it, and totally integrating it within their own contexts? So that's beginning to show us that actually this approach is quite useful in that way. So 100% of teachers have found that this approach is good in communicating the evidence, but actually they're using it as well. So 75% of participants are saying that they regularly use some of the research findings that they've engaged with as a result of this process. And 35% indicated, and we back this up with interviews as well, have indicated that they're now kind of engaging in an expert way. And the next stage for us is to look at the value that adds. And we've got a scale now that we're rolling out to look at the value that adds in terms of their transformative behaviors, how they're now behaving differently within schools. I said that the project was funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. Independently of that, a number of other schools have asked and are paying for us to roll this out, which is quite encouraging for us because it means that they see a lot of value to it, because they're willing to put the money where their mouth is, in a sense. But the project is actually telling us a lot more stuff and a lot more interesting, adding a lot more interesting value to what we know. So to begin with, as I said, we had to identify these opinion formers. We had to kind of some way of accessing them. And the way you do that is you typically ask people questions. You survey people in the whole school. So you say things like, thinking about the last 12 months, who have you turned to as a reliable source of expertise in terms of teaching and learning? And we'll supply the names of the people in the school. And then we talk about the kind of the quality and the frequency of those interactions that people have. So we can start to look at the flows of people within school. So that meant we had to survey everybody in the school. So if we're going to survey everybody in the school, we might as well increase their research burden. Teachers love being surveyed. If they tell you different, they're lying. They love it. And that allowed us to look at these other things, such as centrality. So this idea that there will be in and out flows between different people. And the higher the number of those in and out flows, the more likely it is that information is being moved efficiently and effectively around the school. So we started to be able to look at this idea of centrality. But we could also look at the frequency and the usefulness of relationships with this kind of notion that a strong tie between teachers is where there's a kind of high frequency, high quality relationship. And those are important. If we're thinking about the kind of the development or delivery of coordinated reform efforts and the support of kind of transferring routine or non-routine complex information, then actually that's the kind of stuff that we need. So we started to be able to look at that and the existence of that within schools. And then we looked at other things that we knew were important in terms of facilitating research use within schools. So we looked at organizational learning, the 5 aspects you can see here. So are there cultures within schools that are attuned to innovation? Do those exist? Are teachers being encouraged or enabled in terms of their capacity to engage with and use evidence effectively? So thinking like things like training or peer-to-peer support and so on and so forth. Is there the ability and scope for teachers to trial and develop and evaluate the impact of new initiatives? Are new initiatives being made explicit and the assumptions underpinning them being made explicit so they can be open to challenge? And are there structures to allow information to flow around the school? So these are the organizational learning factors that kind of the research is saying should be in place if we're going to have evidence-informed practice. We also looked at trust scale, and this is very interesting. So we were asking questions like, you can trust senior leaders within this school, you can trust middle leaders or teacher leaders within the school, you can trust each other. And it's important to look at this because actually if we're thinking about kind of ties between people as being the kind of the lever that allows information to flow, then actually it's trust that provides or kind of is the oil in the machine of making sure that ties are effective and meaningful. And so where social relations are steeped in high levels of trust, they're likely to improve student outcomes. And also high-level trust is associated with a number of reciprocal efforts, so collaboration, learning, complex information sharing, problem solving, and so on and so forth. So we looked at all those things. And we put them into this social network survey. And we managed to get responses from 43 schools, 828 teachers in 43 schools. We had more than that. But with a social network analysis, you have to have a response rate of 75% for it to be meaningful. So those are the ones we drew on. So I mean, that was quite a high sample, I think. And we asked these three questions. So to what extent do teachers, the perceptions of teachers in terms of organizational learning affect the culture of research use within the school? To what extent is the culture of research use tied to the kind of the quality of the relationships, the frequency and the perceived quality of those relationships, the interactions in terms of expertise seeking? And what impact does having working in a high trust environment have on teachers' perceptions about the research use climate in their school? And so the aims of the analysis, more or less then, were just to explore these perceptual things. And what we did were to engage in kind of a descriptive and correlational analysis, a multi-level analysis, and we generated some social network diagrams. So I'll show you those as well. The descriptives, Hank, I have a laser. The descriptives were okay, they were interesting. What it shows is that if you think about this being a Likert scale, so 5 is strongly agree, 1 is disagree, most schools believe that they worked in a culture of research use, that they were pretty much in a trusting environment, and that they were being supported in terms of the organizational learning factors, so the cultures, that being able to share, being able to use research and so on. 56%, colleagues engaged with 50% of other colleagues, and they also found that 44% of those interactions were useful. I'm not sure why that isn't higher, but who knows? That's fine. But what was really interesting, now this is I'm going to have to use the laser printer here, pointer here, because this is maybe a bit difficult to see. We ran 3 models. But what these models show was, organizational learning is quite important in terms of an effect size there. We've got an effect size of 0.83. But can you see what's more important than organizational learning in terms of increasing research use in schools? It's trust, right? Which is almost 3 times as important as any other highest factor in increasing research use in schools. So, it's less to do with kind of other aspects. The degree of kind of quality of interaction and usefulness of interaction, that's important. But if you don't have trust, you're not going to have research use in schools. And I would warrant that's probably the case across groups of schools as well. So that's the thing that matters absolutely the most in terms of research use. The other thing that I think is interesting is that you've got 2 different types of schools here. You've got a high research use school and a low research use school. And they're the same number, they're broadly the same number of people in those schools. But can you see the difference in the connections between the school on the left and the school on the right? There's massively different levels of connection there. And what this is showing that is actually in the schools where research use is highest, that people are working together, that they're interconnected, that they're sharing, that they're engaging, right? Now, clearly, that's related to the trust as well, because people only do that when they're operating in a high-trust environment. So again, people will share, they will engage, they will act as champions, and information will flow, but not just in any school, not just in any kind of area. It has to be an area where people believe this matters. So really, the significance for that is the importance of trust in terms of affecting the situation within the school, providing teachers with the access to the relationships that they need, the social capital that they need to be able to draw on expertise, to draw on effective research-informed expertise. And so what matters in a school is not the kind of building blocks necessarily that you put in place, but how you let people engage with those building blocks. And again, it's important. Organizational learning is important. I'm not going to say it's not important. Clearly, it matters a lot, but it matters because trust matters a lot. Okay, and I'm going to kind of finish by looking at a number of ways forward, really. Other areas to consider are that we could do this for policymakers. I think that would work nicely for policymakers, this idea of research learning communities. Clearly, policy works in a particular zone, right? So it works in this zone of where kind of ideology and epistemology come together. So, policymakers believe or act in accordance to the given ideologies of the day and the values of the day, and that's quite right. That's what people are elected to do. But they also have a particular belief about what truth is and what knowledge is. So you can only do that when in a particular zone. But I think that's absolutely fine. If you're going to make a policy, you want to make it as effective as possible, right? It doesn't matter what ideology you're working in. If you've been asked to do something, you've got to do it as effectively as possible. So I think that can work quite nicely. I said before at the beginning that how we approach this idea was that we said to head teachers, to school leaders, what topics interest you? What do you want to do to become research informed? Perhaps a better way to do this, perhaps a more effective way to do this, would be to work with teachers at the beginning and look at their data and say, actually, what matters in terms of your school, in terms of your context, and start that way. And I've been working with some colleagues at the University of Twente in the Netherlands to think about how we combine this idea of research use and research learning communities with data use, and how we can actually add into that process this kind of idea of beginning with the data. Now, this is a kind of this expands the cycle of inquiry somewhat, and it's interesting because you say an 8-stage cycle of inquiry to some people and they just freak out and they don't want to engage with it. So, but I could make that a 4-stage cycle of inquiry with the same steps, but just you wouldn't know, right? So it depends how you present the vision. But the reason I'm explaining it is that it's about, first of all, you do a lot of work on vision, on goal setting, on determining the possible clauses, on hypothesizing before you even get close to the evidence, and then you put the evidence in, and then you evaluate success as a result of that. Coaching. I think coaching is important. I think we put out challenges to schools, to school leaders, to districts, but sometimes people don't always know how to deliver on those challenges. And to what extent will coaching, or could coaching, work to help people become research informed? If we say to people, okay, these are the different things you might need to know about in terms of becoming research informed, but then we offer support in terms of a kind of a coach every 6 weeks, say, who says, well, actually, have you thought about doing this, or have you engaged in this particular way, or have you thought about, and just posing those challenging questions to get people thinking. Because actually, if you coach for a year, then it becomes self-regulating. People can do that by themselves after a year. So as I said, kind of providing this school diagnostic, this initial audit of baseline and as evidence use as a way of kind of saying where people should be getting to, offering workshops, allocating support to people. I've been working with another colleague in the Netherlands in Holland. There's a lot more autonomy, right? So school leaders can engage or act in a variety of different ways. And actually, they found these kind of 16 different domains in which school leaders can act. So ranging from the pedagogy in the school, educational programs offered in the school, methods for teaching, learning, and so on. So there's these 16 domains. But if we think about research use and how it's being used currently, it's probably on these 2 domains. It's about educational programs. It's about the pedagogy in the school. Okay? But if we think about what Viviane Robinson's talking about, she's saying that actually the learning-centered approach to school leadership, so promoting and participating, teaching and learning in development, has a massive effect size, has a massive impact on pupil outcomes. Establishing goals and expectations, resourcing, planning, coordinating, all these things have massive implications. So why are we just focusing on those 2 different areas? There is research, maybe not in education, but there's certainly research in other domains, other areas, in business and so on. That can help. So actually, why aren't we looking at this, across the piece? Why aren't we setting those visions across the piece? And how do those things interplay? Apparently, you're not allowed to ask me questions here. So I'd be happy to take any questions outside when we have a coffee. So thank you very much.